What if I told you there was a sequel to the Revolutionary War that barely anyone talks about? Would you believe it? Well, since it's so specific and I mentioned it at all, you would probably believe it. But that's besides the point. In this video, I'm going to talk about the War of 1812, why it happened, the outcome, and several other fun facts about it. Don't bother subscribing unless you really want to. The next time I'm going to upload is probably 2026 or never. Well, it all started with the French and the British. For several years before 1812, the French and the British fought intensely for trade with America. These two ended up imposing two separate rules. The French made the Continental System, which designated all US ships that went to Britain as enemy vessels, and the British made the Orders in Council, which designated all US ships that went to France to get a license beforehand in England, or they would be shot down. This basically meant that if an American ship didn't follow directions and pulled up to France, it would get captured on sight by the British. And if they pulled up to England, then they would get captured on sight by the French. This and other offenses, like the British seizing American citizens who deserted the Royal Navy, really pissed off the Americans, but it didn't spill over to war just yet. However, things were still getting worse. The Americans were starting to look imperialistically northwards to Canada, but the Native Americans, or in this case Canadians, were not having it, obviously. However, being the great defenders of native liberty that they are, wink wink, the British helped out the natives against the Americans, which forced them to a standstill. The natives believed their only hope of survival was with the British, and the Americans believed their only hope of expansion was with the British leaving. Soon after this, America decided to declare war, though a bit suddenly. This, of course, took the British off guard, who were already fighting a war against the French and were completely unprepared for a war, though the Americans, to be fair, were also unprepared as well. However, that didn't stop them from saying that they could take Canada without a single soldier lost. Yeah, sure, buddy. To start out the war, the Americans had a three-pronged invasion of Canada. However, things did not go to plan, obviously. The Americans were unprepared and lost in each of the three battles they had in Canada. What was most egregious was that they surrendered Detroit without even firing a single shot, though in the long run that might have actually worked out. However, things were going a bit better for them at sea. They won a quite few battles against the British, which the most notable being of the US Constitution, also known as Old Ironside. This ship had four successful cruises and were basically the 2018 LeBron of the US Navy at the time. This didn't last long, however, as the British quickly returned to dominance. They used their navy to ship troops to Canada and then blockaded and raided the American coast, which caused a devastating impact on American finances and kept their warships at bay. Finally, they also won several single ship duels to even the score. In the Northwest, the Americans had to fend off against both the Native Americans and the British, and were under siege in Ohio, which is a terrible place to be under siege in. However, the Americans managed to hold out and force the enemies back to Canada, ending the Ohio campaign. They also managed to win in Detroit in the Battle of the Thames, and this series of wins boosted American morale, which was getting quite cooked after a poor start to the war. In 1814, things started to look bleak again due to Napoleon's loss in Europe, as Britain was finally able to actually focus on the war in America. They managed to occupy Maine, take over the Chesapeake Bay, and then focused on something much more valuable: Washington. On August 24th, 1814, British General Robert Ross captured Washington and set fire to many important buildings, like the White House and the Capitol, striking at the very core of the US. However, all was not lost yet, as things didn't go as planned for them in Baltimore, where the US fended off a naval bombardment of Fort McHenry, which, fun fact, was the inspiration behind the Star Spangled Banner. At this point, it had been 3 years since the war started, and both sides were getting weary. So, they decided to sign a treaty which saw the US stop its demands of stopping the British from forced recruitment of Americans who deserted, and the British stopping its demands of changing the Canadian borders. Overall, neither actually got what they wanted, but they were both so tired of fighting they didn't even care. Funnily enough, in New Orleans, a British force were unaware of the treaty and attacked New Orleans, only to get destroyed by Andrew Jackson and his forces, which just added to the Americans' feeling of hype and patriotism after managing to hold the mighty Britain to a standstill, despite the war not actually achieving a single goal that it was supposed to. The aftermath of the war included Britain seeking peaceful relations with the Americans, which has managed to continue to the present day. Also, it led to even more American patriotism, with them managing to survive their first big test as a new nation. It also saw the emergence of Canada as an independent nation. However, there was a loser in the aftermath, and it was the Native Americans, who would continue to get oppressed and invaded by the American government in their way westward. Overall, this war, despite being the sequel to the much talked about Revolutionary War, is quite undercovered. The war itself had a lot of twists and turns, but ended up in a stalemate, with a treaty that would change the trajectory of both nations in the years to come.